The Tamron 35-150mm f2 to f2.8 Z-mount lens versus the Nikon Z 24-120mm f4S lens. Now both of these lenses have a very similar focal length, but both are different in many ways. So which one should you buy? Find out next. Okay, let me just start off by saying this is going to be super tough because I love both of these lenses, but at the end of the day, you might only have enough money to just buy one. So do you go with the Tamron with the 35-150mm focal length and it can have some absolutely beautiful bokeh in your shots, or do you go with the Nikon 24-120mm, which is very popular and it is awesome value for money? Let's talk about the size and weight to begin with. As you can see by the samples here side by side, the Tamron weighs in at 1,190 grams, whereas the Nikon, it weighs at 630 grams. So that's almost half the weight of the Tamron. Minimum focus distance on the Tamron at 35mm is just 33 centimeters, whereas on the Nikon 24-120, minimum focus distance is 35 centimeters. However, let me just make a point here. When you zoom in on the Tamron and you go to 150 millimeters, your minimum focus distance then becomes 85 centimeters, whereas on the Nikon, it doesn't change. So if you go from 24 to 120 millimeters, your minimum focus distance of 35 centimeters does not change. Prices on both these lenses at the time of making this video, the Tamron retails at 3,499 Australian dollars or 1,999 US dollars. The Nikon, on average, it retails here in Australia for $1,699 or in the US, $1,099. So there is quite a difference there in pricing, and that may be important to you when it comes to your budget and how much you've got to spend. So both of these lenses share the same zoom style. They're both push and pull zoom lenses. They're not internal. And both almost share the same identical twist of your wrist zoom when you're going from minimum focus distance to maximum focus distance. Here's an example of the difference between focal lengths shooting some video. And this did surprise me a little when doing this test. You can see the Nikon is considerably wider in the frame at 24 millimeters as compared to the Tamron at 35 millimeters. And when you do push into both lenses' maximum focal lengths, the Nikon at 120 millimeters and the Tamron at 150 millimeters, but it's mainly on the wide angle where you'll see the bigger difference. After using both of these lenses, I found that the focusing speed was about the same between the two of them. As well as when it comes to sharpness, they were pretty much on par with each other as well. So I actually think that is very good coming from Nikon being an f4 lens. Let's talk about the bokeh out of both of these lenses now and which one has the more softer and delicate type background when it comes to your photographs. And this one you would think is a no-brainer really because the Tamron is far superior due to its aperture. But have a look at these examples. On the left you have the Tamron at 35 millimeters at f2 using the minimum focusing distance of 33 centimeters. And on the right, you have the Nikon at 35 millimeters at f4. You'll notice that Nikon seems a little bit further away, and that's because the minimum focusing distance is 35 centimeters on that lens. I'll let you be the judge on which one you like better. So hold the phone there before you start announcing Tamron as the winner. Let's have a look at what the bokeh is like at the end of each lens. So looking at the samples now, look at the Nikon at f4 at 120 millimeters as compared to the Tamron at f2.8 at 150 millimeters. I actually give it to the Nikon there on the long end. So there were some very interesting results when it comes to the bokeh out of these lenses. I think the Tamron on the wide end is far superior, whereas I actually like the Nikon because you can get closer to your subject at f4 and you really do get a beautiful type soft bokeh background out of that lens. But on the Tamron at 150 millimeters at f2.8, because I've had to back away, the subject was further away. So the bokeh wasn't as good as the Nikon. Okay, let's talk about filter threads. On the Tamron, you've got a less common type filter thread of 82 millimeters, whereas on the Nikon, it has the more common 77mm filter thread. So both of these lenses have been touted as one and done lenses. So which one would be realistically the one and done lens for you? And say you were just going out for the day or you were going around the world, which one lens would you take with you? Well, I believe that really depends on the type of photography you're going to be doing. I don't really consider the Tamron lens to be a one and done lens, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I don't believe it's wide enough at 35mm, and the second is the weight. If I was walking around all day with this lens and camera, I would definitely have to use it in conjunction with my shoulder strap here. I only bought this shoulder strap for something like $15 off eBay. I'll leave you a link to that in the description box below. I don't get any sort of money from that. It's only to help you guys out if you need a cheap shoulder strap. But can I just make a very quick suggestion? Have a look at this. What if you teamed this Tamron lens with this Nikon 14-30mm f4S lens? What a dynamite little combo this would be for traveling. Things like landscape, you'd be covered with that 14-30 f4S lens. But then for things like your nice bokeh of flowers or people or your low light situations, you've got the Tamron lens. But say for example, you still wanted to get a wider lens and you wanted to stay within that aperture range like the Tamron has, Nikon also have that wide angle 17-28mm f2.8 lens. Or if you wanted something like a wide prime, consider the Nikon 20mm f1.8S lens. You'd certainly be covered for wide angles with either one of those lenses. But for me personally, being more like a landscape guy, and because I don't shoot apertures around that f2 and more like around f8 to f11, then this 14-30 teamed up with this 35-150mm Tamron. Now the other great thing about this combo with this Nikon 14-30mm and the Tamron 35-150mm, both of these lenses have 82mm filter threads. So I can use things like my case landscape photography filters. These are 82mm. I can simply use those on both of these lenses. But for me personally, the true one and done lens would be the Nikon 24-120mm because of its compact size, its lightweight, it's got that constant f4 aperture right throughout the zoom range. And it's sharp. It's a great lens. I've had this lens now for just over a year and a half, and I'd much rather be walking around all day with this lens as compared to the Tamron. Now, one viewer once left a comment on one of my videos here on my channel, and they said, why would you want all this bokeh on all your travel photos? And I kind of understood his point of view. I guess what he didn't realize is if you did have something like this Tamron lens, you could just stop it down a little bit and you'd get greater depth of field. But I kind of got his drift. I know what he was getting at. Yeah, because why? Why would you want to go to places like Paris and you want to have the Eiffel Tower out of focus in the background, or you went to Japan, you got Mount Fuji out of focus in the background? So in that case, you don't really need something like that Tamron lens. You'd just be having the Nikon lens. Say with the Nikon lens with its minimum focal range of 24mm, I'd be really taking advantage of that. When I was in Paris, I went inside places like the Musée d'Orsay, the Grand Palace, and I'd rather have that wide focal length. And when I was walking around places like Venice or Rome in Italy, I'd also want a wider focal length for those tight spaces and walkways to get wider angles for things like the Colosseum and St. Mark's Square. But this is my point where I was talking about the type of photography you're going to be doing. So for example, I was going to Japan to shoot the Cherry Blossom Festival like I did back in 2017. I would definitely be taking this Tamron lens because at that f2 to f2.8 aperture, I could get some really beautiful bokeh on all those cherry blossoms. And if I really wanted shots that had a bigger depth of field of focus, in other words, I wanted to see things like Mount Fuji in the background, then I would just simply use a higher f-stop number on the Tamron. So we've talked about some of the differences between these two lenses. So which one realistically should you buy? Both. No, if I had my choice, I would have both, but say you could only buy one. I guess there's a few things you have to take into account. Firstly is your budget, how much money you've got to spend. And secondly, you really have to think about the type of photography you're gonna be doing. And the third one is, do you want a more compact, lightweight lens in your camera bag? Or do you want to sacrifice that by going with a heavier lens, but it's more diverse in the type of photography you can do? If you bought the Nikon and you did want more shallow depth of field in your shots, I guess what you could do is invest in some prime lenses, but that would cost you more money and weight in your camera bag, plus the inconvenience of changing lenses. Whereas if you bought the Tamron, you'd be pretty much covered for all that shallow depth of field type shots, all the way through the focal length of 35 to 150 millimeters. As I mentioned, I believe the Tamron is far more diverse, so you can use it for lots of different types of photography. But the Nikon is more compact, lightweight, it's very sharp and great value for money. In fact, I still stand by what I said about this Nikon lens in my initial review on it. I believe it's the best value for money S-line lens that Nikon has on offer at the moment. So speaking of reviews, I've actually done individual reviews on both of these lenses, and what I'll do is I'll leave those for you right here. You can go and check out. Hopefully it'll help you out a little bit more. Well guys, thank you so much for watching. I wish you the very best of luck in terms of which lens you go with. I like both. I think they're superb. Never stop creating, and I'll see you next time.